This is episode 276 of the Books, Shows, Tunes, and Mad Acts podcast. This episode is titled Campus Protests and Free Speech. Well, summer is getting busy, so we'll have a few weeks here when I don't post a new episode, but that gives you an opportunity to go back and listen to the previous episodes of Books, Shows, Tunes, and Mad Acts and its predecessor, Dear Discreet Guide, where we talked quite a bit about career advice, and work issues. So enjoy a little hiatus here, and we'll see you in a few weeks. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Books, Shows, Tunes, and Mad Acts. I'm your host, Jennifer Crittenden. Books, Shows, Tunes, and Mad Acts is brought to you by Discreet Guide, the training company for improving your speaking and writing skills. Thank you for joining us, and tune in on Mondays for new episodes. I am so pleased to welcome a new guest to the show today. I've got Kristen Shahverdian with me from PEN America. So welcome to the show, Kristen.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yes, I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. We're going to talk about campus protests about the Israeli-Hamas war. But first, I'd like to introduce Kristen. So pleased to have another person from PEN America on the show. I think you might be my third or fourth or maybe even fifth.
Oh, fantastic.
Yes, I've just found the organization to be such a wonderful resource when it comes to these really complex issues like free speech or book banning or these campus protests. So yeah, really excited to have an expert to talk about this on the show. So she's the program director of Campus Free Speech at PEN America, developing campus engagements and public events related to free expression and education. Teaching has been a consistent interest throughout her career. After a decade in dance and choreography, she began researching best practices for participatory art projects and how to teach art that depicts violence and traumatic events. She previously served as a project manager for the Philadelphia Folklore Project and facilitated workshops on trauma and art at the College Art Association and Dance Studios Association. She's also a writer and editor at the online dance journal Thinking Dance. Before joining PEN America, she was a senior lecturer at the University of the Arts in Philadelphia and previously was an adjunct professor at Rowan University and Temple University. She received her BA in History and Dance from Hamilton College, her MFA in Dance from Temple University, and her Master's in Socially Engaged Art from Moore College of Art and Design. So yeah, so honored to have you with us today. And let's just dive right in. Speaking for myself and maybe for others, I think we're all getting a little bit confused about free speech issues on campuses. Can you start by giving us some background on how historically free speech considerations have been treated on public university campuses?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. You mentioned a key distinction, right? So when we think about free speech issues on campus, this distinction between public and private does become important. And the reason has to do with the First Amendment, right? So First Amendment protects people's rights to free speech, to freedom of expression, to press freedom, freedom to assembly, the right to petition the government. But it's really a restriction on the government's ability to regulate speech. And therefore, the First Amendment applies to public universities. Now, a lot of private universities express their adherence to the First Amendment. Not all, but a lot do. And also, like, for instance, in California, there's actually a law that says private universities must be adhere in the same ways that public do. So there are, some ways in which you can speak about public and private, but when you're really thinking First Amendment rights to freedom of speech, and right now, rights to protest, we're really thinking about those public universities. So I think that's just an important distinction that is not always, like, in the general public, people aren't always aware of. So that's kind of just to lay the landscape. Whereas private universities, as I said, some might have policies that adhere very close to the First Amendment, and then others can run the gamut. So in this case, we're thinking about what are the policies of the university, right? As it pertains to freedom of speech, and as a part of that, protest rights. And you asked historically. So I actually was thinking a little bit about, okay, so we're in this moment now. If we really think historically about free speech, there is the free speech movement, right? Which actually took place in 1964, 1965 academic year at the University of California, Berkeley. And this is when students protested and used civil disobedience. And I'm sure we'll talk about civil disobedience today, but they used this to fight for the university to kind of lift bans that were currently in place around political activities and speech, right? Their speech rights. So really prior to this free speech movement, there was much more curtailing of freedom of expression on campus. It really came about because of this free speech movement that we talk about at Berkeley. Eventually, the university did overturn these policies that curtailed their speech, and it really paved the path forward since then for much more freedom of expression and academic freedom for students on campus, and of course, faculty as well. So that student activism really exploded at that time. And we see it, and we think back, even if we're not deeply entrenched in the history, I think most people have, at least anecdotal or visual images of protests on campus throughout the 60s over the civil rights movement, over, of course, the war, right? This is a really big one as we get into the 70s. And then since then, I think it's kind of ebbed and flowed throughout time. It's at certain times and on certain campuses, it's more prominent. And at other times, it's been maybe less protest generally. But that's really where we sort of trace, I think, a lot of our beginnings in this country when we think about freedom of expression and free speech on campus. And I think, and I can get into this now, or we can go into it later, but this is really key when we think about protests now, and we think about protest, and then we think about civil disobedience and what those mean, and like the historical context, how we look back on them, and also how they're playing out today, as we see them on campuses.
Yeah, let's dive in. So what are you seeing as differences now in this current moment compared to, sort of our romanticized view of the past?
Right. I mean, I think a lot of us have been really thinking about the past in this moment, right? Because, and a lot of connections have been made in the media to other protests in the past, certainly to some violence on campuses like Kent State and others that have come up as we think about the protests today. I mean, I'll take a moment and just talk a little bit about protest and civil disobedience. And I think those can be misconstrued or sometimes, seen as the same, and how are they different is really important in this moment. So let's put it this way. When you think about protests on campus, especially these public universities, and it is, again, this protected right that students have and faculty have, of course, on campus, those are protected, and they can have some restrictions, which are called like time, place, or manner restrictions, right? These are restrictions that a government and universities can put on free speech, right? So that, like, not all speech at all times is actually protected. Protest at all times anywhere is not protected. And so these restrictions are often called time, place, and manner.
I see.
So an example could be that you cannot be on the quad at 2 a.m. with a bullhorn, just yelling loudly while people are trying to sleep. So that would be kind of a restriction on the time, a restriction on place, and a restriction on the manner, right? Which is like using a bullhorn at 2 a.m.
Okay.
So those are what we call viewpoint-neutral restrictions on protest and on speech. They're, again, time, place, and manner only. They're not based upon the content of the speech. They're not based upon the viewpoint of those making the speech, right? So that's a really important restriction that can happen in this space on protest.
Interesting.
So yeah, and so
you can say whatever you want. You just can't wake everybody up in the middle of the night yelling about it.
Right, exactly. Because it's not about the view. The restriction is not about the viewpoint. And we've seen this a lot. And again, I know we'll talk about this a lot, but there's certainly some of the speech that we've seen out there has been offensive to some, anywhere the gamut of, bothering me to just outright offensive to making me feel really uncomfortable, a person who's in that space, right? But most of that speech, most, I would say, like a lot of it, because there's quite a hard bar for it not to be, as long as it's following the time, place, and manner restrictions, is allowable.
And so let me just ask you kind of a ridiculous question. So, what if the time, place, and manner restrictions were essentially you can only speak for 1 minute at 10 on Friday night, and
Yeah,
then you're done?
right. So
Like,
that's
how
right.
how does that get sort of sorted out?
Exactly. So this would be something that would be considered unreasonable, right? So
Okay.
this would be really curtailing one's speech by making it almost so impossible or so narrow that one could not reasonably be able to speak out, right? And we will see this happen when it comes to things like zones of speech, right?
Mm-hmm.
So where we at Penn America will be very we're very cautious, and we really generally do not support saying like free speech can only happen in this space, is kind of to get at what you're saying, is if you make it so restrictive that you're saying it's a time, place, manner restriction, but in fact the restrictions are so extreme that they're still really curtailing quite a lot of speech,
Gotcha.
that there is room to push back against that. And this is somewhere where we would speak out. Other organizations that do this work, like Fire or ACLU, may, depending on the circumstance, be these are moments where they may speak out as well. We at Penn do a lot of public advocacy, speaking out against these, and also private advocacy, where we talk to universities and campuses and actually try to have a conversation with them and explain why this particular policy or rule is sort of in fact curtailing or restricting speech, even if it's technically by the book.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are other orgs that might even, go so far as litigation and things like this. But this is absolutely where we try to use our voice and our relationships in the higher education space to try to really encourage administrators who may, if we could at least give good faith and say perhaps a rule was put in place with a good intention, without really thinking through the ramifications of
Yeah.
what that actually means against speech, against the speech at hand. And your example is still not even going into sort of a viewpoint example, right? It's really just saying that it's just these time, place, manner restrictions, which are again allowable, have gone too far,
Mm-hmm.
and that's really where we would push back against them. Absolutely, in this space. And then to kind of, maybe if I'll just kind of wrap up this part with saying a little bit about civil disobedience in this space, because civil disobedience does break time, place, manner restrictions, right?
I see.
So
Sort of by definition, you're saying.
right. And that
I
is, I think,
see.
absolutely. So, I think that this range of views on protest, and where I said sometimes the conflating or confusion around
Mm,
protest, where it was, does it break a rule or not?
right.
When it becomes civil disobedience and not, civil disobedience, I think, has been misunderstood by some because of our look back in history. And civil
Yeah.
disobedience does hold a really important place in our history. We can look back and maybe have a romanticized view of it, or perhaps we see the noble cause for which it has been, which we often see it as part of, say, the civil rights movement. It was also
Mm-hmm.
maybe not as much on campuses, but certainly when you think about those fighting in the AIDS AIDS
Right.
activists, right? Like
Sure.
this
Mhm.
civil disobedience was used really effectively for change,
Mhm.
and so I think it is easy to look back and see it as noble and worthwhile, and therefore perhaps free of punishment. But it's that second half where I think things
Mhm.
have gotten confused a little by some. A protester who is breaking time, place, and manner restrictions should not assume that they wouldn't be sort of disturbed, or there may be consequences
Mhm.
for those actions. And in fact, when it does come to civil disobedience, those partaking in it, it is that intentional breaking of the law that is actually important.
Uh-huh.
So seeing the image of protesters being arrested was intentional. Protesters would go into civil disobedience, whether that was chaining themselves together or on a fence,
Hmm.
or choosing to do different things that broke the law. The image of seeing them be arrested for what many were perceived as rights that people should have, say in the civil rights
Right.
movement, right, sitting at a counter that was designated as whites only, breaking that law could be looked, and then being arrested for it was part of the action.
Gotcha.
And so,
Okay.
we look back on it as a favorable light, but in the moment, it may or may not have been seen that way, depending on where people stood on the issue.
Sure.
And so where that comes to today, I think, is to say that those partaking in civil disobedience and who have in these protests, I hope have done so with that understanding, right? That I am choosing to break the law, and I know there will be consequences. Where I think, and so that's one side. And so perhaps there are some who haven't realized that actually there are consequences for civil disobedience. And in fact, that's the point.
Right.
And that kind of connection of that is, I think, has gotten missed by some, not all, but by some.
Okay.
On the other side of that, I think there have been the reaction to civil disobedience on many, many campuses has been disproportionate to what students and some faculty have been doing. So sort of draconian measures. And I say this to say, for instance, what we saw initially at Columbia, right, which started to kind of set this whole thing off, was to instantly send in police, as a response. And we saw this and in other universities as well, was to send in police, often outside police on bikes, police on horses, doing some drastic measures to kind of stop protesters, arrest protesters before any other action, before any other things had come to fruition, right? And so, and there's different ways we could say that. It could be the speed at which police were called. It also could be just disproportionate. So when the police were called at Columbia the second time, right? So the protesters, just as a quick, for your listeners, a quick review here, because I know there's
no, please do. Yeah, because it's a bit of a blur for me. Yeah,
so much has happened. It's like me keeping track of it as well. But the encampment first went up after the president had spoken in front of Congress, in front of the commission, I should say, and the protesters put up the initial encampment, and then within a very short amount of time, I think it was like 36 hours, give or take, they were arrested. And that was sort of the initial spark that set off these solidarity encampments and other protests. But then Columbia went into a series of negotiations and tried to do some of what we would say, would be what we advise, right? It's talk to protesters, allow them to be there if they're peaceful, and as long as actual operations can still happen on campus, as long as students can still go to class, they're not being blocked, or, those time, place, manner haven't become so overblown that students in a class can't hear their professor. I think we have to have a little bit of grace in this period that a certain amount of peace is being kept and students and normal operations can still happen. Class education's happening. The university can still do their functions.
Yeah.
So Columbia went into that period and they were having negotiations, and then negotiations did not, as we would have hoped, right? They didn't go to fruition. They didn't come to agreement. Some people did leave the encampment, but there was some who then went in and they took over a hall, inside. So then they went into a building. So at this moment, it wouldn't be unreasonable to say, okay, Columbia has to do something next. Now they've taken over a building. What happens next? At Penn, what we felt happened next, and I mentioned the first instance was the speed at which police were called felt too much, right? Felt disproportionate. In this case, you could say, well, they went through a period of, negotiations. Maybe, if you feel it was time to call the police, then to us, what happened next was a really disproportionate number of police came in, right? And so here's where you saw a lot of police entering the building, and then a lot of, and again, conflicting things about what happened or didn't happen, because it's very challenging to know from the outside what's going on. Even people within will have very differing stories. But this kind of, again, that's another way that sort of a disproportionate response could look like in this space. So it's not to say, again, like to come back to that point about civil disobedience, I think it's a mischaracterization to think that civil disobedience means, oh, well, I'm peaceful, even if I'm breaking laws or breaking policies, therefore there should be no consequences.
I
That's not
see.
quite right.
Hmm.
But to say that those consequences are so disproportionate or so extreme, so quickly to come, I think is where another point of what these protests have illuminated in terms of a lot of campuses' responses.
Thank you so much for explaining that to us, because I was thinking about Kent State while you were
Mm-hmm.
talking, which, of course, we all think of that event with horror,
Right.
rightly so. But in fact, those students were protesting the war, and they actually burned down the ROTC
Mm-hmm.
building, which that would surely be an act of civil disobedience. However, it doesn't mean you have to pay for that with your life, right?
Right.
So that's a good example of what you're explaining there, that
Yeah.
there will be
And
consequences, but it doesn't mean that you should be,
it, right.
they should open fire on you because you've burnt down a building.
Exactly. And this is, I think, a big fear when police are called in. And it's not to paint all police in one way. Like some have quite a lot of experience in de-escalation. But when a university chooses to kind of go that step, I
Hmm.
think that there are real safety considerations because certain things at that point might be out of the university's control,
Right.
depending on the situation. So, there are campus police who ideally have
Hmm.
understanding of what it means to work with college students. I
Hmm.
have anecdotally heard different amounts of, some campuses maybe more than others have
Hmm.
they have that training, but they should be, I would think, at least normally assume that they work with college students. This is they know this space
Hmm.
well. So, ideally they have that de-escalation training. They have a sense of we're going to try to keep this safe, but certainly historically and, up to this current day, bringing in a lot of police to something that has been otherwise peaceful, even if offensive to some,
Hmm.
can, I think, be a potential recipe for that kind of escalation, right?
Hmm.
And so that, I guess, is just another piece of this is
Who do you call in?
yeah, who you call in and how many in number and how a lot of people are thinking about safety, and that's a very loaded word and means a lot of different things to different
Right.
people. But if you're thinking about sort of a physical safety in this moment, how bringing in police is still keeping things safe is something to be just considered, and it might
Right.
be that in this moment police might be needed to keep something safe, but I would argue that it should be very much a last resort, and really because there is a safety need, right? Something is going off. There is whether it's violence or aggression, or something is happening that is requiring that presence, is when you would I think go to that step to call the police.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective on calling in the police. I think, as Americans, we all have different views about what that means to call the police.
Mm-hmm.
Some people are like, they see something very minor and they think that the police will come in and fix it. And then other people are like, never call the police under any
Mm-hmm.
circumstances, right?
Right.
Because their presence is always a negative. And of course,
Yeah.
the truth probably lies in the middle and depends on all kinds of complicated things.
Yeah, so many complicated things. And every individual, and their history and who they are and their
Hmm.
identity, and just there's just so much there that makes it, yeah, absolutely really challenging.
Yeah, but let's talk about this idea of safety, because that
Mm-hmm.
does get cited by campus administrators and lots
Mm-hmm.
of people,
Yeah.
parents too, right? That's a justification to, I use the term crack down on
Sure.
protesters, but yeah, sometimes it does mean literally cracking down on them.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, what advice does PEN America have for institutions that are, reasonably trying to avoid physical conflict when there are protests and there might be counter protests?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, safety is tricky. And I say that because, like I already said, that means something different to different people and different contexts, even, and depending on how we're thinking about safety. Campuses do have an obligation, right, to keep students, faculty, staff, everyone there physically safe. Oftentimes in this space on campuses, when we talk about safety, it's worthwhile, I think, to dig in a little about, are we talking about physical safety? Are we talking about being uncomfortable? Are we talking about being offended?
Mhm.
I'm sure there's other words we could think of too, but outside of protests, I do work a lot with campuses on kind of navigating all kinds of free expression issues across campus, whether that's, in the classroom, whether that's a book a faculty member chose to put on the syllabus, or it could be a speaker
Mhm.
coming to campus, or something another student said. I think the word safety, or another comparable word is I've been harmed, right?
Mhm.
It comes up a lot in these spaces. And so administrators, faculty, confidants, whoever students are talking to, I think it is worthwhile when it's possible, maybe not in the height of a protest, it's always possible, but when it is possible, to dig in a little bit and ask some questions about what one means by safety is, I think, it's worthwhile. And, even just to think about our own language around these, maybe making that even a little more expansive, to have a little more sense of that there are different ways in which we use these terms, and they can mean different things, as I say, to different people. So that's kind of an overarching principle that I often will talk to campuses, and particularly staff and others too, about, is to really think about and ask questions, right? When you say you feel unsafe, can you explain what you mean by that? Do you feel physically, are you worried that you're going to be hurt physically?
Mhm.
That could be true in the context, of course, of the protest, perhaps.
Mhm.
But also, does it mean that you just are really, like, you don't want to walk by it? It bothers you, or
Mhm.
you feel, it's just so offensive that you're feeling like you don't belong here. And all of these are really awful things that people can be feeling.
Mhm.
But it does mean different things. So unpacking it, I guess I would say, is one step on the question of safety. There is something along with that, and there are legal experts on campus. I am not a lawyer, although I get to work with a lot of them, so I I enjoy that very much. I always say, if I hadn't gone into the arts and teaching, I might have gone to law school. So I
Sure.
enjoy it, and it's very interesting work. And I work more on the side of education and how to really uphold freedom of expression, have these robust protections for it while you maintain inclusive campuses. And, certainly this is really hard work. It's very much in the public eye right now how hard it is. But I'll say the one side, and again, these are the legal experts and people on campus who are responsible for making sure that certainly campuses, because of their obligations under what's called Title VI and Title IX, these kind of protect discrimination, right, on the basis of race and sex, respectively. So these apply to speech that could be said to create a hostile environment.
Right.
The bar for this is very high.
Okay.
What is considered a hostile environment is sort of harassment that's they use the word severe,
Mhm.
persistent, and pervasive.
Mhm.
And it kind of really limits, and this is where people are talking about it right now, right?
Mhm.
This behavior really limits students' abilities to participate in their educational programs. So
I see.
again, the bar is very high,
Mhm.
but it's something that I think, we're seeing play out in some cases quite publicly, where people are really asking those questions and thinking, I think, really hardly about, like, very, it's a lot to grapple with, right? I think it's really hard, and it's hard to make the case. But it also is absolutely true that there are, I think, students who have said that they feel this way, right? That they feel that these protests have made the learning environment untenable for them. So
Okay.
these are things that universities are grappling with. And I think, they will continue to. I expect that this will continue into the fall, some level of protest, and we know election is coming up in the
Yeah.
fall. So I think this idea around speech, around policy, around safety will continue. And I do think campuses will be spending a lot of time this summer grappling with these as they move forward.
Is it fair to say that the universities are in a position where they're having to balance someone's right to free expression with someone else's right to pursue their education without hindrance? Is it fair to say that's what campuses are kind of in the position of?
I mean, I think that you articulated that really well in terms of the work of upholding freedom of expression and inclusive and really diverse campuses, right? So
Mm,
that is, hearing you say it, I'm like, yeah, that's actually the crux of like the work that we are doing to try to help campuses on that path. And it is going to be a long journey, but
yeah.
I absolutely think that that work hasn't isn't just, by the way, these protests aren't even just since if we go back to October 7th and all of the initial protests and then this more recent wave. I
Hmm.
think that's brought it even more to the public eye, but this has
Hmm.
been a narrative actually for campuses for quite a while.
Hmm.
So, we have seen this and we see it play out around different issues. We know there's a lot of contested speech when it comes to speakers brought to campus. So this has been a big one. I mean, I think it has popped up, but protests have overtaken all of our our brain space right now.
Yes,
I know,
right.
right? But if you look back, there's been plenty of, there was at Stanford, Judge Kyle Duncan. That was a big one that happened at Stanford about, gosh, it could be 2 years ago. But I might be wrong on the date, but that happened in the recent past where students kind of protested him coming to speak,
Hmm.
shouted over him, and then an administrator kind of gestured and kind of defended the students, and then there was all of this public debate where, this administrator took the sides of the students against speech, right? Kind of chose, quote, maybe safety or inclusion over speech. And then
Hmm.
there's been other times where, speakers have come to campus and administrators come out with kind of a statement saying, well, this speaker has the right to be here because we believe in free speech.
Hmm.
And so I think a lot of times what the work that we're doing is to tell administrators and help everyone on campus say that we want robust protections for freedom of expression and for academic freedom. That does include speakers whose views many may find offensive. That
Hmm.
includes protests where perhaps protesters are holding signs that are offensive to some or even saying words, slogans out loud that some might find offensive, that we want to have those robust protections because those also protect the right for others to have their speech, right? And to
Hmm.
bring in their speakers. And university is actually this unique space
Yeah.
where these ideas can get aired
Yeah.
and battle, and whether you call it debate or you call it deliberation or it's discussion or dialogue, and I would argue all of those need to happen on campus, right?
Hmm.
That it's in that kind of quote public square, but it's also in the classrooms that these are aired. I mean, this is the uniqueness of higher ed and why we believe in these spaces.
Hmm.
And this is like my big, I always say this, if I'm writing this out, this is in capitals. And university leaders and others need to do a lot of other work to help students and everyone understand what these mean. Like, why have the First Amendment? Why do we have free speech protections? What does academic freedom mean? What value does it have for me? Because I think a lot of people don't really see it as value right now. And also, how do we have more open and respectful discourse? How do we actually
Yeah.
learn that as a skill?
Hmm.
How do we build these communities together? How do we have different spaces where different people can come together? And this is why I say discuss, dialogue, debate,
Hmm.
deliberate, right? All of these things. How do we teach these? Because, students are coming to higher ed from a high school experience that does not actually have those as their like sort of inherent values, right?
Right.
Students don't actually have the right to sort of wear whatever they want or, wear a t-shirt with offensive language on it in high school.
Hmm.
Everyone is much more constrained. High schools also tend to be less diverse. Students tend to
Hmm.
live in areas that are less diverse, both ideologically and in other ways, whether it's around
Hmm.
race or, social economic status. So this experience of going to college might be the first place for that. It,
Right.
it often is.
Mm-hmm.
So I always say, don't expect them to land on your campus and sort of by osmosis absorb what free speech
Right.
means or what any
Mm-hmm.
of these mean, you know? So the work of creating sort of campuses where people understand these concepts of freedom of expression and academic freedom, and also filling in how we support people on campus, how we address impact, right, around language, around speech, with not by getting rid of the speech, but there's ways administrators can address impact through
Mm-hmm.
support, through, mentorship, through dialogue, through trusted, mentors, etc. But also
Education.
education, right? Through, I mean,
Woohoo!
through education. So I always say that it's like they're uniquely suited to do it. Where I think they need help is help, like where are the programs? Kind of see help some, helping draw those maps. Kind of like what are the programs you can implement? How can we? And there's others doing great work in this space around dialogue, around
Mhm.
all of this work. And so how I think we can all help support higher education to connect the dots, to put in these educational programs to help make it sustainable for them, institutionalized across their campus. But, coming back to this idea of sort of this balancing act. And sometimes I think of it often less of like a scale that we're trying to balance
Okay.
and a little bit, I think of like three balls I'm trying to keep in the air, or
I
like this
see.
idea of we can hold multiple things in our mind at once, however, although hard it may be, multiple things are true at once. And so I kind of imagine, this freedom of expression, free speech, academic freedom, and inclusive, diverse campuses and like how they intersect and how we hold all of these up in the air is again hard work.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes one wants to take over at the
Mm-hmm.
expense of another, but then it's like our obligation to like, okay, wait, we have to bring these together because they all actually need each other in order to really flourish and for the
Mm-hmm.
campus to flourish.
Yeah, and as a society for us to, as a country, yeah.
Right. Exactly. If we think about like, yeah, exactly. These people coming out into our world and what we're setting them up for, right?
Mm-hmm.
It to be, like you say, yeah, part of our world, part of our communities, our workplaces, our democracy, all of it.
Mm-hmm. It's one thing I really admire about Penn America is I think, it has been an institution that has been stalwart, straightforward, clear about freedom, the importance of free speech and freedom of expression, why it's valuable, and also that you've been willing to be pretty clear about it. I remember when I interviewed Suzanne Nossel about her book Dare to Speak,
Mm,
and she said, when someone says to me, I don't feel safe, which is a common thing that you hear now when people hear things that they don't like.
hmm
They say, I don't feel safe. And she said, it's not enough to just say that. There has to be, as you have explained, an exploration of what that means, and that discomfort, sort of psychological or emotional discomfort, is not the same as physical violence against
hmm
you. And so, weighing as you're in the process of putting all these balls in the air, you can't just take one of those balls away by saying, I don't feel safe. And,
hmm
that kind of straight talk, I think, is really helpful in this climate that we find ourselves in now, because it is easy to get those balls out of whack, I think, as
hmm
you start delving into that kind of psychological discomfort. Something I really appreciate about Penn America and the work that you guys do, because I think a lot of times it's easy to throw away the free speech ball.
hmm
Right. It's sort of the easier choice is, well, let's just not have that guy come to campus. Right.
hmm
It's going to cause so much disruption. And then a lot of times, people will self censor, right? Because
hmm
it's just easier. So I'm always nervous about things that are easy. And the result of that is loss of free speech or loss of discussion, loss
hmm
of, that kind of mediation and learning those skills, because then
Yeah.
then we don't learn, right? We don't learn how to listen to people who appear to be voicing views that we don't agree with. I want to talk a little bit more about a specific example because I was quite shocked about this when I read about it. My alma mater is Indiana University in Bloomington, and I was really quite astonished when the university chose to bring in the state police, which, to your comment earlier about, who do you bring in, to Dunn Meadow. So Dunn Meadow is this 20-acre field really outside of Student Union. It's in the center of campus, and it has a long history of an area where free speech is allowed. And so I was really quite surprised that they took such a strong step in a place that has this history behind it, right? Yeah, because it's almost a monument, right, to free speech, Dunn Meadow. Tell me what you think about what happened at Indiana University, about this idea of spaces for freedom of expression, and then when a university decides that they can change their mind about whether things are okay there or not.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I have read about this, and we absolutely we're watching it, and I think you pointed out a couple things here in this example. I mean, in terms of the idea of sort of zones of free speech, I would say that we are, for sure at Penn, we're sort of skeptical if there is sort of this is the zone of free expression. Now, plenty of campuses have kind of the favored area, right? Where this is the normal area where these things happen, right? And so that is, of course, absolutely fine. And it's wonderful to know that there is kind of this gathering space, this area where freedom of expression is like understood. And I think those actually provide really great educational opportunities for people entering campus to know the history of this space. And this is, this is the free speech area that happened and why. And can be then like such an integrated way to learn about freedom of expression, right, for incoming students. So there's certainly nothing wrong with that. Where things can be a problem is like if schools have free speech zones that are actually quite relegated, right?
Yeah.
And you alluded to this earlier when you mentioned this like narrow place where a protest can happen for 1 minute, and that's sort of like the most extreme. But certainly, if a school has a regular, even if it's a pre-existing policy that's like, well, it's very narrow where free speech can happen, then that is really can become a problem, and we really don't support those. They can, in fact, potentially be on a public campus a violation of the First Amendment, depending on how narrow that is. What we saw here in this case, I mean, I think is a couple things. Is, of course, as you already mentioned, the police being brought in, and then in this instance, a rewrite of a policy.
Yeah.
Right? If I'm correct, that the policy was rewritten from my reading by 4 people, no faculty involvement, no student involvement. And it happened the night or day before this protest was supposed to happen. So when you think about time, place, manner restrictions that should be viewpoint neutral, this appears to be an absolute example of not viewpoint neutral policy change. And I would say, I would caution campuses first, any policy change that you are making in the midst of a crisis is by its very nature, mostly impossible to be viewpoint neutral. I mean, you are making a choice that now I need to change the policy. All these other protests have been fine. All these other speakers, whatever it is, have been fine. And now, because of this one coming, we are going to change a policy. I mean, by its very nature, that is not viewpoint neutral. So that is a huge red flag. Some of the other, a smaller point that I did mention is, not having faculty involvement, not having student involvement is, having 4 people come together to change a policy would appear to be really against the norms of a university, particularly, a public university. So, I think those are 2 really alarming things. And of course, you mentioned, the bringing in of the police into this and arrest the state police, right? So we're talking about that escalation, campus police, city police, state police, we're really escalating it. And I believe 33 protesters were arrested. To your point, very problematic at this university. So I would echo what you are feeling about it. Absolutely true. And I think one thing we haven't mentioned specifically is also then the punishments for many of these. So even if charges are dropped, some of these students are facing suspension. That is a very extreme measure to go for students. I mean, to really think that they are no longer able to continue with campus. Like some are barred from coming onto campuses, right? I mean, these are very extreme punishments. And so we talked earlier about sort of draconian measures when it came to police response, speed, and size of police. I would also say, and of course, just arrest, but I would just also say that I think these punishments that are coming down on some students, I think should really be really looked at carefully, and I think in many cases reconsidered. And hopefully, as we move into the summer, I would hope that that might happen in some places. I am unfortunately think it will not in all, and I think it will be a choice of students how much to fight or not. But it is very much really an issue and a problem to think of these punishments being this extreme.
Yeah, that has really surprised me.
Hmm.
Where they suspend even faculty,
Even
that they've
faculty,
told
yeah.
faculty that they can't come on campus. And yeah, it seems really hurtful in a way, like you're no longer welcome on our campus
Hmm.
because of your participation in something that, has a long history in the United
Yeah.
States. So yeah, but sentimental old me, I was like, wow, that seems really hurtful to someone to say you're not welcome here anymore because of something that you've said. Yeah. I've been really surprised to see how these protests have been characterized in the press,
Mm,
that they're characterized as pro-Palestinian. That seems to be what a lot of the media has settled on. Although I've also heard people refer to them as pro-Hamas, which
hmm.
seems, really kind of out there, rather than anti-war.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think anti-war might have a different connotation, and the press is aware that we might
Yeah.
have a different response to a protest that we see as anti-war instead of pro-Palestinian. But can you talk to us a little bit about, our own judgment of the legitimacy of someone's
Mm,
speech or someone's protest in this context, and what we need to keep in mind as we're reading in the newspaper about
mm.
these protests? And so, kind of counsel us a little bit about, don't forget about this.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I actually hadn't thought a ton until you asked it about that specific characterization, how they're not characterized as anti-war, which in the past was, I think, very much a huge part of the way protests, the Vietnam protests were characterized as like very anti-war or peace even, right?
Mhm.
And I think that's really interesting. And so as I kind of ruminate on that, I've definitely was thinking about one, our obligation as outsiders, wherever we sit on it, like however we might feel personally about whether they should be protesting or not, or where we might sit on the ideological spectrum or any of it. I think I do try for myself even to check any biases I might have, whether it's about a protester or a counter protester, to say like, am I, re is there any desire in me to curtail that based on viewpoint? And how do we
Mhm.
really go back and say, and really make sure for ourselves as we're looking in, first we're not there. So it's very,
Yeah.
unless we are, maybe some of your listeners are, but unless we are there, we are, we're reading about it. Maybe we're watching a video on it and how we see it as legitimate or not. I would love to think of us as being part of, honestly, a culture that's upholding the right for it to exist, regardless of how legitimate we see it or not see it. So that's like one part of it, I think, that as a culture to
Mhm.
just try to uphold. And I know, and that is really hard, of course, to do when we see things that we don't agree with, or that we
Sure.
do feel like, that we might feel are harmful. But I do think that that's a part of this. There's different ways that this, of course, is characterized that I think if you look at different media, different sources, will paint it differently. I mean, I have certainly tried to look at different sources as I'm reading about a protest and have noted absolutely the amount to which something might be characterized as like pro-Palestinian or to your point, pro-Hamas or um,
Anti-Semitic.
anti-Semitic
Mm-hmm.
or anti-Arab or whatever, right? So there's
Mm-hmm.
ways in which I think, depending on our news source or where we're getting our media, we might be seeing it in certain lenses. And it is very interesting. It will be interesting as we look back to think about
Mm-hmm.
how much did the protesters claim this sort of pro-Palestinian viewpoint, or how much was that the media, right, putting on it, and how much was this seen as anti-war as opposed to perhaps it wasn't actually anti-war. It was really about like sides kind of drawing lines or trying to
Mm-hmm.
really, and so that will be interesting work as we look back.
And sometimes I see the protesters are defining themselves as anti-genocide. And so,
Mm-hmm.
this spectrum between pro Hamas and anti genocide, it's very
Yeah,
interesting, right? How far apart those poles can be,
absolutely.
right? Because, I mean, to be anti genocide, I mean, surely no one would disagree with that, right?
Right,
But,
right.
so yeah, the labels that we put on things.
Yeah, and it kind of feeds a little bit into something that we think about at Penn. We have a team that works on this, but is yeah, the amount of like disinformation or misinformation, right, that's come out of this, and how do we, I mean, all of us honestly work to like vet our sources and really think like
Mm-hmm.
take note of like where are we getting our information from, even if it's just noticing, like you're saying, the different language used and just having a moment to reflect on that and making sure of it. And one of the ways, certainly, that this protest and just is really exemplified, but we've seen this for maybe the last decade or so, but the role of social media in all
Mm-hmm.
of this, and then therefore the role of, dis and misinformation, I think plays in. And I think it's connected to your question or to your thoughts about how different people see things as legitimate or not, and how different words are used to characterize it. It's just, I think, so much more heightened now
Mm-hmm.
than it was, even a decade ago, let alone in 1970, right? When a lot of the Vietnam War protests were happening, and people were getting their news, I think, from fewer sources, and there was much less of that kind of siloing of where we get our news and
Yeah.
how we learn about things. And that's why I think you can have so much variation in accounts on an event that's happened.
Hmm. I think that's a really good point. Things have changed. And in a situation like this, it really becomes apparent where people are getting their news and so
Mm-hmm.
what their view is. As you look at this moment in time, I'm curious to look into your brain and to see, well, like, what things do you think are different about what's happening now? Like, what is striking you as unusual about this particular situation, if anything?
One of the things that I have thought about is how this particular issue, which has been so divisive and for quite a long time, has put students in a lot of ways against each other in a way that
Mm,
feels different. It's not to say that students haven't been in conflict before, and certainly we've seen that, with speakers, but this
hmm.
particular one, I think, has put some students who might have been in certain stances on, quote, the same side,
Hmm.
no longer. And that,
Hmm.
I think, is something that like campuses are really grappling with, and does seem
Right.
really particularly challenging here in a
Hmm.
different way, right? This is not like sort of, and again, I always hesitate to sort of use right and left because broad, like paint, I think we're way more complicated than that. But
Good. Thank you.
yeah, right. But like, and I'll say, but I hate to say the but, also against it, but like, if we were to say like certain speakers who come to campus, there were, I think, ways in which a group of maybe more students who would call themselves more liberal or progressive might come together, there feels like in this case some really different ways that and again, I hate to say lines are drawn, so let's say that like people are finding themselves, and that feels new somehow in
Hmm.
this time. And so I think that's one challenge. I think other things that we've seen, in this I mentioned social media, and we've seen that, of course, in the past, but it's just ever increasingly heightened. And because of the also long-term nature of this, campuses are just exhausted first, let's say, right? So if you think about the last time where there were lots of significant protests in 2020, campuses were shut down. This is a group of students, many of whom did a lot of their high school virtually, maybe started college virtually, are sort of in this kind of space, like for the first time. So, and they are compounding with like an issue that is so challenging and has been so challenging for so many for so long. Because it's so challenging, I would argue, has often been avoided by many on campus. So not all, but many. So we're dealing with that. We're dealing with people who are some people very personally affected, right, by the war, who are part of this. Silos around where we get information, mis and disinformation, the explosion of social media. I think some lack of sophistication when watching snippets of video to sort of say, it's like this, and paint a lot of story and not really dig in to realize that a video is only going to show you a really narrow slice of something. Encampments, of course, are also new in this. I mean, not completely new ever, but, I think for this sort of generation and this time, and for campuses to have that happen has kind of brought up a different piece to this that campuses I do think are struggling with. Like we're okay with protests, but how do we feel about encampments or tents on our space, or like you're sleeping overnight? Like a lot of those are breaking policy. So again, that kind of navigation around like how much do we push back and say these encampments can't happen, and how much do we see it as part of peaceful protest? How much is that kind of rubbing up against even just like a visual image of encampments on our campus? And that's not the image of protest that many people maybe have.
Right.
So I think those are sort of some new things that campuses we're taken aback by and are struggling with in this space that kind of feel different.
Oh, those are such good points. Yeah, it's funny when I was reading some of the comments about some of the videos that were posted by NBC about the protests at Columbia. I was really surprised how many people said, what are these students doing acting like homeless people? It was like, we're just sort of triggered by this idea of tents on campus, right?
Sure.
Yeah, that's such a good point.
I can think back and remember kind of Occupy Wall Street, which I, feel like used them. But it's interesting that how that was with these students were quite young then. So it is interesting though that how this has become sort of whether you call it a tactic or, a visual strategy or whatever, but it is, I think, something very new in this space. And I think, to your point, I do think it could be, it is triggering, I think, for some around just the image of what a campus should look like, what a protest looks like, what it means to have bodies and spaces kind of, 24 hours. I think there's a lot there that's been really challenging.
And the other one, the point that you made, which of course is so obvious, I feel really dumb for not thinking it through. I mean, here we are right in the middle of the Jewish Arab conflict, right? That's been going on for a really long time.
Right. Yeah, I know. Right.
So no wonder the complexities of this particular situation do seem very severe because it is very serious, right?
Yeah,
it's much different than protesting, a single comedian coming to campus.
Absolutely. And, and then at the end of the day, that maybe is 24, 48 hours, maybe a week, if, but it's not this, and I have spoken with many, many people on campus in the last few months, and they're, it's just exhausting the way in which this has gone on for so long. And I think that's also very, very hard here, for everyone, honestly, across campus. So that's another challenging thing, which, certainly happened back in the civil rights movement and with the Vietnam War. But I think in recent history hasn't happened on campuses quite the same.
Well, and I would argue that, trying to get the U.S. out of the Vietnam War was relatively simple compared with, the Jewish Arab conflict that has been going on for a really long time. So yeah.
When this first started, I was telling a story to someone on campus just to say that it's because it was right up maybe November or something. And I just had this thought of like, wow, it's so interesting. I go to a lot of campuses and I ask, where are your pain points? And we're going to write some scenarios for people going through our workshops to work on. And I would say, I actually think universally one issue that came up always was Israel-Palestine.
Oh.
And always we were asked, let's not do a scenario on that. It's just too hard.
It's too hard.
So I think, we're dealing, it's just one small piece of this or maybe large piece, we'll see, but it's not all of it, of course, but it just that kind of thing where this issue that is so hard for world leaders,
right?
Let alone, right, everyone on campus. So it's just has also been an issue that campuses have, I think, avoided. Not all, but many. So
yeah, well, maybe it gives us an opportunity to really grapple with something hard, right?
Very hard.
Yeah. Test our principles. Well, it's been so lovely to talk to you. Thank you so much. It's just been great to have you put these things in perspective for us. And before I let you go, is there anything you'd like to share with the audience?
Well, I've talked a bit off and on about our programming at Penn. So I'll briefly say that we, as I mentioned, do educational programming, and we are really, our work comes out of our research and reports that really have dug into free speech, diversity, and inclusion on campuses and how to uphold them all. And we've developed some resources that people can find for free online, called our Campus Free Speech Guide, our reports, other statements we've made about the protests, but also going all the way back to 2018. So those can be found at Penn's website, penn.org. And then also, I run programming where we really partner with campuses to help faculty, staff, student leaders, like I say, really grapple, not just with the big questions around how do we uphold freedom of expression on campus, but actually then drill in to give people kind of a toolkit of like how you can do this in your classrooms as faculty, how you do it as staff working with students one-on-one, and how you do it as a student on campus to have, both that, to really feel like you can really speak and be a part of the campus community, but you're also supported in that community. So you're part of this, ideally this kind of higher ed community space that's lots of ideas are flourishing, and also people are really supported there. So that's the kind of the work that we do with campuses. And all of that can be found out about on our website.
Yeah, and I'll include those links too in the show notes.
Wonderful.
for the episode.
Great.
Yeah, so thank you so much for taking
Thank
the
you.
time. Yeah, it's just been great to talk to you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Our goal in 2024 is to expand our audience because we get such great guests. So we'd love your help in spreading the word by sharing, subscribing, liking, thumbs upping, rating, and commenting. Got all that? Really, thanks for any support. Books, Shows, Tunes, and Mad Acts is brought to you by Discreet Guide, the training company for improving your speaking and writing skills. Also, a shout out to Podomatic, our podcast hosting platform. You podcasters out there might want to check them out. They've been good to us. And finally, thanks to Quincas Morera for the theme music.